Hello and welcome to the Frontline Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Jonathan Hausler. You're listening to the audio version of the Fantasy Hangover. I'm going to start this one off with a warning. I'm going to be talking about the Bellpocalypse right away, so if your team got demolished by Le'Veon Bell and you're still in the grieving process, you have my permission to skip the next maybe 30 seconds, and we'll go from there. It's Le'Veon Bell's world, and we're all just living in it. If you missed it on Sunday, Bell had just a few fantasy points. He ran for 203 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns, and had 63 receiving yards, which was a godlike 47 fantasy points. He had his way with the Bills' defense, who unfortunately perished during the Bellpocalypse. Bell had the most fantasy points scored by a single player since the Holocaust in December 2013. I'm killing it with these puns today, apparently. Where Jamal Charles scored 5 touchdowns and totaled more than 200 yards, and that equaled 51 fantasy points. Apparently, I'm ending all my sentences with fantasy points. Sorry, not sorry. All right, back to business. For those of you who had Bell, congratulations on most likely winning your matchup this week. If you're currently in a 2-week playoff, you're probably well ahead of your opponent, as am I. As Bell showed us on Sunday, one player can single-handedly win a playoff game, which makes it even more important to get your starting lineups right. On the flip side, overall, Week 14 was a huge letdown, and more studs put up duds than I can count on 2 hands. Looking around at all my fantasy leagues, hardly anyone had high-scoring games. Mike Clay, an ESPN football analyst, tweeted that Week 14 was the lowest-scoring week this year and last year, but Week 15 was the second highest last year, so there may be hope for those that failed to score many points. Cheer up, if history decides to repeat itself. I've talked a lot about looking at your players' matchups when making lineup decisions this year, but there are other factors to consider as well, such as team situations, recent performances, and injuries. These issues can be hard to keep track of, especially if you're busy, so I decided to make it easier for you by tackling some players that are currently on the struggle bus and should either continue to be started or benched until they get it together. Disclaimer, before we dive in, remember that my opinion is not gospel. First off, Russell Wilson. After a career-low game where he threw 5 interceptions, is it time to bench Wilson? I'm not so sure. He doesn't have a bad upcoming schedule. He has the Rams, the Cardinals, and the 49ers, and I can see a bounce-back game from him against the Rams at home this week, who just fired their head coach and are now leaderless. Yes, the Seahawks usually struggle against the Rams, but I think they'll rebound this time. I say you give Wilson another week to prove himself if you have the luxury, but because we know he can be a quality quarterback. Next up, Drew Brees. I think we're kind of jinxing Drew Brees. After his first single-digit fantasy game since 2010, Brees put up another single-digit fantasy game. Something isn't right with the Saints right now, which makes it hard to trust Brees in the playoffs. However, unless you have a better option on your bench, there's probably not anyone else worthy to take his place on the waivers. Like Russell Wilson, I would give him another chance against the Cardinals and see if he redeems himself and breaks his single-digit streak. Next up, Devonta Freeman. In a game where the Falcons scored 42 points and blew out the Rams, you'd think that one of those touchdowns would have come from Freeman. But no, he had 6 carries for 6 yards. Instead, it was a Tevin Coleman show. However, Freeman has an amazing playoff schedule coming up. The 49ers, the Panthers, and then the Saints. And I think you can keep him in your lineups. Yes, Coleman is a problem, and it's hard to figure out which one's going to perform well that week. But Freeman will still get his. Next up, Spencer Ware. This one is kind of a tough one. And Ware's kind of tough to figure out right now. He started out the year hot, but the past 2 games, he's averaged around 2 yards per carry, which is not good. On top of that, the Chiefs aren't using him in the passing game very much, even though he does have the pass-catching skills. Right now, he's pretty touchdown-dependent, and in the leagues that I have him, I'm hesitant to start him, especially since I need a win. I've been high on Ware for most of the season, but if you have better or similar options, I would bench him. Lamar Miller. Miller is another hard one to pin down. 1 week he puts up 1 fantasy point, the next week he puts up 18. How do you know which Lamar is going to show up? I ask the question, will the real Lamar Miller please stand up? On top of his inconsistency, he also seems to get a new injury every week, which makes him hard to rely on at this point in the season. Combine all of that with the worst quarterback in the NFL, Brock Osweiler himself, and you have a volatile situation. Miller doesn't have a terribly hard schedule, but if I had better options, I would bench him. Next up, A.J. Green. If you held on to Green through his injury and you made the playoffs, you might be in luck. Word is that Green is going to start practicing this week, and he got in a limited practice today, and he could even play this coming Sunday against Pittsburgh. I would keep checking to see the latest on him, but if he plays, he could be the savior of your playoff chances. Next up, Adrian Peterson. Like A.J. Green, Peterson is supposedly returning to practice this week, And he says himself that he hopes the line is straight garbage. Like, literally, they could put trash cans in their place and they would produce the same as the Vikings' current offensive line. Second, look at Peterson's stats before he got hurt. In Week 1, he had 19 attempts for 31 yards. In Week 2, he had 12 attempts for 19 yards. And then he got injured. Definitely not a stellar performance. With that being said, we're talking about Adrian Peterson, and if there's anyone that can produce behind trash cans, it's him. I wouldn't be comfortable starting him unless you have nothing to lose, if you're in the consolation bracket maybe. But it may be worth it to pick him up just so that your opponent wouldn't have him. I want to hear from you. What other players are you hesitant to start in the playoffs? Who didn't I talk about? What questions may you have? Let me know. You can tweet at us, and you can also comment below in the blog post on our website. While you're here, check out our player rankings, starts and sits, and our weekly podcast on frontlinefantasyfootball.com. Thanks.